Hi, I'm Kara. I was sitting in that sterile conference room, my hands shaking as Jessica slid the papers across the mahogany table. Just sign here, she said coldly, pointing to the highlighted line. It's what's best for Emma and Tyler. My mother nodded approvingly from her chair, while my father adjusted his tie like this was just another business meeting. The adoption papers stared back at me, my children's names typed in black ink, ready to be transferred to my sister's custody permanently. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They thought I was weak, thought I was broken, thought I had no choice but to give up my babies. But when I walked into that courtroom 3 weeks later, the judge looked up from his bench and smiled. Well, well, Judge Marcus Chen said, if it isn't my old study partner from constitutional law. Their faces went white. They had no idea who I really was or what I'd been building in silence. And that was just the beginning. Let me take you back to where this nightmare started. It was a Tuesday morning in October when I got the call that would change everything. I was in my tiny office at Morrison & Associates, reviewing case files, for a custody hearing later that week. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days fighting for other people's parental rights while mine were about to be stripped away. My phone buzzed, and Jessica's name flashed on the screen. We hadn't spoken in months, not since the last family dinner where she'd made snide comments about my lifestyle choices and how I was raising my kids as a single mother. Kara, we need to talk, she said without any greeting. Her voice had that clipped professional tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news. It's about Emma and Tyler. Meet me at Dad's office in an hour. The line went dead before I could ask questions. My stomach dropped. Emma and Tyler were everything to me. 8-year-old Emma with her wild curls and endless questions about why the sky was blue, and 6-year-old Tyler who still crawled into my bed during thunderstorms. They were staying with my parents for the week while I worked late on a particularly complex case, something I'd done dozens of times before. I grabbed my coat and drove across Denver to my father's law firm, the prestigious downtown office where he'd built his reputation as one of Colorado's top corporate attorneys. The building gleamed with glass and steel, a monument to success. That had always made me feel small when I was growing up. I'd chosen family law instead of corporate work, much to his disappointment. There's no money in helping broken families, he'd told me during law school. You should think bigger, like Jessica. My sister had followed in his footsteps, landing a partnership at a rival firm by the time she was 30. She had the perfect life, the perfect marriage to David, and the perfect house in Cherry Hills. The only thing missing was children, something she'd been trying for years to achieve. When I arrived at the conference room, they were all there waiting for me. My father sat at the head of the table in his expensive suit, looking every bit the powerful attorney he was. My mother, Linda, wore her pearls and that expression of disappointment she'd perfected over the years. Jessica sat across from them with a stack of papers in front of her, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. David lurked by the window, avoiding eye contact. The room felt cold, sterile, like a morgue. Sit down, Kara, my father said, gesturing to the chair across from them. I remained standing. Where are my children? I asked, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. Jessica looked at our mother, then back at me. They're safe. They're at our house with David's mother. We've been talking, and we think it's time to face some hard truths about your situation. My situation. The words hit me like a slap. Yes, I was a single mother. Yes, I lived in a modest apartment in Capitol Hill instead of a mansion. Yes, I worked long hours to support my kids and pay off my student loans. But I was a good mother. Emma and Tyler were happy, healthy, and loved. They never went without anything they needed. And they certainly never doubted that their mom would do anything for them. "What are you talking about?" I asked, though part of me already knew where this was heading. I'd seen enough family court cases to recognize the setup. Jessica leaned forward, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd used since we were kids. "You're struggling, Kara. You're always working, always stressed about money. The kids are practically raising themselves. Emma told us she's been making her own breakfast most mornings because you leave for work early." The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth in it. I did leave early some mornings when I had court appearances. Emma, mature for her, 8 years, had learned to pour cereal and help Tyler get ready. I'd taught her basic kitchen safety and was proud of how responsible she was becoming, but Jessica made it sound like neglect. "That's not fair," I said. "Emma helps because I'm teaching her independence. They're well cared for, and you know it." My mother finally spoke up, her voice dripping with false concern. "Darling, we're worried about you. You look exhausted all the time. You're living paycheck to paycheck. The children deserve stability." Stability, the word they always used when they wanted to criticize my choices. Because stability meant money to them, not love. Not the bedtime stories I read every night, or the way Tyler and I built blanket forts on Sunday mornings, or how Emma and I practiced her spelling words while making dinner together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica slid the papers closer to me. "We've found a solution that benefits everyone. David and I can provide the children with everything they need. Private schools, college funds, a stable home with 2 parents. You can still see them, of course. We're not monsters, but they need more than what you can give them right now." I picked up the papers, my hands trembling with rage rather than fear. The legal language was complex, but the intent was clear. They wanted me to voluntarily terminate my parental rights and allow Jessica and David to adopt Emma and Tyler. There were clauses about visitation rights, but they were vague and revocable. Essentially, they wanted me to give up my children and trust that they'd be generous enough to let me remain in their lives. "You're out of your minds," I said, tossing the papers back onto the table. "I would never sign these. Emma and Tyler are my children. I'm their mother." My father's expression hardened. "Don't be dramatic, Kara. Think about what's best for them, not what you want. Jessica and David can give them opportunities you never could." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. I looked at each of them, these people who were supposed to love and support me, who were supposed to be my family. Instead, they sat there like vultures, circling what they perceived as weakness. They saw a single mother struggling to balance work and parenthood, and they decided I was failing. They never saw the sacrifice, the love, the countless nights I stayed up helping with homework or soothing nightmares. They never saw the joy on my children's faces when I came home, the way they ran to me with stories about their day. "I'm leaving," I said, standing up and heading for the door. "And I'm taking my children home where they belong." Jessica's voice stopped me cold. "I don't think you understand the situation, Kara. We've already filed preliminary paperwork with the court. There's going to be a hearing next month to determine custody. If you fight this, things could get ugly. We have documentation of your work schedule, your financial struggles, the times you've had to leave the kids with babysitters." I turned around slowly, finally understanding the trap they'd set. This wasn't a family meeting. This was an ambush. They'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Gathering evidence, building a case, positioning themselves as the responsible relatives stepping in to save neglected children. My legal training kicked in, and I realized how carefully they'd orchestrated this moment. "You documented me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My mother at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We kept notes, yes. Times when you were late picking them up from school, when you had to work weekends, when you couldn't afford that field trip. Without our help, Each word was a knife, twisting deeper into my chest. They'd turned every moment of vulnerability, every time I'd accepted their help, into ammunition against me. David finally spoke from his position by the window. "We know this is hard, Kara, but the courts always rule in the best interest of the children. Jessica and I have a stable marriage, a beautiful home, and the financial resources to give Emma and Tyler everything. You're barely keeping your head above water." The worst part was that some of what they were saying was true. I did struggle financially. I did work long hours. There were times when I questioned whether I was doing enough, whether my children were missing out because I couldn't afford the extras that other kids had. But love, I'd learned from my years in family court, wasn't measured in dollar signs. Some of the wealthiest parents I'd encountered in custody cases were the most neglectful, while some of the poorest fought harder than anyone to keep their families together. "Where are Emma and Tyler right now?" I demanded. Jessica checked her watch, an expensive piece that probably cost more than I made in a month. "They're at our house doing homework with Mrs. Patterson. David's mother is wonderful with children. Much better than those teenage babysitters you usually hire." Another dig, another careful notation in their mental case file against me. Yes, I hired teenage babysitters sometimes because I couldn't afford professional childcare. But they were responsible kids from the neighborhood who Emma and Tyler adored. Mrs. Chen next door also helped out when she could, and the elderly woman loved my children like her own grandchildren. We had a community, a support system that maybe didn't look traditional but worked for us. "I want to see them," I said. "Right now." My father adjusted his tie again, a nervous habit he'd had since I was a child. "That's probably not a good idea tonight. They've had a big day, and this transition is difficult enough without confusing them further." Transition, as if it was already decided, as if my children were already gone. I felt something snap inside me, a protective instinct that went beyond rational thought. "You can't keep me from my children. I know my rights." Jessica smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course you do. You're a family law attorney after all. You know exactly how these cases go. You know that courts favor stability, financial security, and two-parent homes. You also know that a prolonged custody battle could be traumatic for Emma and Tyler." She was threatening me, using my own children's well-being as a weapon. If I fought back, she'd make sure the process was as painful and public as possible. If I gave in, I'd lose them, but they'd be spared the drama. It was a devil's bargain, and she knew I was trapped between my love for my children and my fear of hurting them. I walked to the window where David stood and looked out at the Denver skyline. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere out there, Emma and Tyler were probably wondering why I hadn't come to pick them up as promised. They were probably asking for me, maybe starting to worry. The thought of their confusion and fear made my chest tighten. "You have no idea what you're taking from them," I said softly. "It's not just about money or big houses or private schools. It's about knowing that your mother fought for you, that she never gave up, that she'd move mountains to keep you safe." I turned back to face them. "Emma reads at a high school level because I spend hours with her every night going through books. Tyler isn't afraid of thunderstorms anymore because I taught him that they're just nature's way of watering the flowers. They know they're loved unconditionally, not because of what they achieve or how they behave, but simply because they exist." My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though I couldn't tell if the tears were real or performative. "We know. You love them, sweetheart. That's what makes this so hard. But love isn't always enough. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is recognize when someone else can provide better opportunities." I'd heard those words before, in court, from parents who were genuinely unable to care for their children due to addiction, mental illness, or extreme poverty. But that wasn't my situation. I was a functioning adult with a career and a stable home. My only crime was not being wealthy enough to satisfy my family's standards. The papers still sat on the table, waiting for my signature. I imagined signing them, watching my children grow up from the sidelines, being relegated to the role of fun aunt while Jessica and David became mom and dad. I pictured Emma's graduation, Tyler's wedding, moments when they'd look out into the audience and see Jessica's face instead of mine. The thought made me physically sick. "I need time to think," I said finally. Jessica nodded, but her expression remained cold. "Of course, but don't take too long. The court date is set for November 15th. If you're going to do the right thing, it's better to do it voluntarily rather than have a judge make the decision for you." November 15th, 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to figure out how to fight the combined resources of my wealthy family and their legal connections. 3 weeks to prove that love and dedication mattered more than bank statements and square footage. 3 weeks to save my children. As I left that conference room, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Walking through the marble lobby of my father's building, past the portraits of distinguished attorneys and their achievements, I realized that everything I'd worked for had led to this moment. My law degree, my experience in family court, my understanding of the system. It was all preparation for the fight of my life. I drove home to my empty apartment, where Emma's art projects still hung on the refrigerator and Tyler's toy cars were scattered across the living room floor. The silence was deafening. For the first time since becoming a mother, I came home to a house without the sound of little voices calling, "Mommy." Without the chaos of backpacks and lunchboxes and homework sheets scattered across the kitchen table. I sat on my couch, surrounded by the evidence of my children's lives, and let myself cry for exactly 10 minutes. Then I wiped my eyes, made a cup of coffee, and opened my laptop. If they wanted a legal fight, they'd chosen the wrong woman to underestimate. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this battle my entire career, not intentionally, but circumstantially. Every case I'd won, every precedent I'd studied, every strategy I'd developed was about to be put to the ultimate test. They thought they held all the cards because they had money and connections, but they'd forgotten something crucial about me. Something that had been true since we were children. I was the one who studied harder, fought longer, and never gave up when something mattered to me. And nothing had ever mattered more than Emma and Tyler. I pulled up the court filing system and began researching Judge Marcus Chen's recent custody decisions. That's when I saw it, the assignment notice that would change everything. The Honorable Marcus Chen, appointed to family court just 6 months ago after years in corporate law. Marcus Chen, who'd sat next to me in constitutional law at University of Colorado. Marcus Chen, who'd been my study partner for the bar exam. Marcus Chen, who'd told me over coffee one day that he wanted to switch to family law because corporate work felt soulless. Marcus, who knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. For the first time since leaving that conference room, I smiled. My family thought they'd stacked the deck in their favor, but they'd missed the most important card in the game. They were about to discover that quiet people, underestimated people, sometimes have the most powerful allies in the most unexpected places. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Professor Williams had been my mentor in law school, the woman who'd encouraged me to pursue family law despite my father's objections. She'd taught me that the law wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about justice, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "Kara," she answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Word travels fast in legal circles. Are you ready to show them what you're really made of?" I looked around my apartment, at the photos of Emma and Tyler laughing, at the life we'd built together against all odds. "I've been ready my whole life," I said. "I just didn't know it. Yet." The next 3 weeks would determine everything. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had a fighting chance. They'd underestimated me before, and it had always been their mistake. This time, that mistake was going to cost them everything. The memories came flooding back as I sat in my quiet apartment that night, each one a piece of the puzzle I'd been too close to see clearly. This wasn't the first time my family had tried to erase me from my own life. It was just the boldest attempt yet. I was 7 years old when it started, though I didn't recognize it then. My parents had enrolled both Jessica and me in piano lessons with Mrs. Kowalski, a stern Polish woman who taught from her home in Highlands Ranch. Jessica took to it immediately, her fingers dancing across the keys with natural grace. I struggled at first, my small hands fumbling over the scales, but I was determined. I practiced every day after school while Jessica watched television or played with friends. After 6 months, Mrs. Kowalski told my mother that I had shown remarkable improvement and suggested I audition for the youth orchestra. I remember the excitement bubbling in my chest as I ran home to share the news. But when I burst through the front door, breathless with joy, I found my parents sitting at the kitchen table with Jessica, discussing her upcoming recital. "Mom, Dad, guess what?" I said, practically bouncing on my toes. "Mrs. Kowalski thinks I should try out for the youth orchestra." My mother looked up from the sheet music she was reviewing with Jessica. "That's nice, dear, but we've decided to focus our resources on Jessica's musical education. She's showing real promise." My father nodded in agreement. "The youth orchestra is quite expensive, Kara. Between the fees and the travel costs, it's just not practical for both of you." Jessica smirked from across the table. "Maybe if you practiced more instead of reading all those boring books, you'd be as good as me." My parents laughed, and my mother ruffled Jessica's hair affectionately. "Our little virtuoso," she cooed. I stood there in the doorway, the excitement draining from my body like air from a punctured balloon. The next week, I watched from the audience as Jessica performed at the spring recital, her blonde hair perfectly curled, wearing a new pink dress that sparkled under the stage lights. My parents beamed with pride, recording every note on the bulky camcorder Dad had bought specifically for the occasion. When it was over, they rushed to the stage to congratulate her, flowers and praise flowing freely. I had prepared a piece too, a simple melody that I'd practiced until my fingers moved without conscious thought. But when I asked Mrs. Kowalski if I could play it after Jessica's performance, my mother quickly intervened. "We don't want to take attention away from Jessica's moment," she said firmly. "This is her night." That became the pattern. Jessica's achievements were celebrations. Mine were inconveniences. When she made honor roll, they took her out for a fancy dinner. When I made honor roll the same semester, I got a pat on the head and a reminder that grades were expected, not rewarded. When Jessica scored the winning goal in her soccer championship, they invited the whole extended family over for a barbecue. When I won the regional science fair with my project on renewable energy, they mentioned it briefly at dinner before moving on to discuss Jessica's upcoming dance competition. The inequity became so normalized that I stopped expecting different treatment. I learned to celebrate my victories quietly, in the privacy of my room, where I kept a small journal documenting my accomplishments. Academic awards, writing contests, debate team victories, all recorded in my careful handwriting, but rarely acknowledged by the people whose approval I craved most. High school brought new opportunities for my parents to demonstrate their favoritism. Jessica decided she wanted to be a lawyer like Dad, and suddenly every conversation revolved around her future career. They bought her expensive prep courses for the LSAT, hired private tutors when her grades slipped, and took her on visits to prestigious law schools across the country. I watched from the sidelines as they invested thousands of dollars in her education while constantly reminding me that college was expensive and I'd need to earn scholarships if I wanted to attend. The irony was that I was the better student. While Jessica struggled with constitutional law concepts and barely passed her ethics courses, I devoured legal texts like novels. I understood nuanced arguments that made her head spin, and I could write briefs that our mock trial coach called brilliant. But when college application time came, my parents hired a private counselor for Jessica while handing me a stack of scholarship applications. "You're so independent, Kara," my mother said when I complained about the disparity. "You've always been self-sufficient. Jessica needs more guidance." It was their favorite excuse, painting my competence as a reason to neglect me rather than celebrate me. I was too smart to need help, too capable to deserve support, too strong to require encouragement. The summer before senior year, both Jessica and I were accepted to internships at different law firms. Hers was at Dad's office, a prestigious position that came with its own parking space and lunch allowances. Mine was at a small family law practice downtown, working with attorneys who specialized in custody cases and domestic relations. I'd applied on my own, written my own cover letter, and interviewed without any family connections to smooth the way. That summer changed my life. Working with families in crisis, I saw children caught between parents who used them as weapons rather than protecting them as treasures. I witnessed mothers fighting tooth and nail to keep their babies safe from abusive fathers, and fathers struggling to maintain relationships with children turned against them by vindictive ex-wives. I learned that love wasn't always enough, but it was always worth fighting for. Meanwhile, Jessica spent her summer filing paperwork and answering phones at Dad's firm, complaining constantly about how boring corporate law was. But when August Hopworth arrived and our parents asked about our experiences, Jessica's stories about important client meetings and high-stakes negotiations dominated the conversation. My tales of helping reunite a father with his daughter after a bitter custody battle were dismissed as depressing and not real law. College applications revealed the final insult. Despite my higher GPA, better LSAT scores, and more impressive extracurricular activities, Jessica received early admission to Dad's alma mater while I was waitlisted. I later learned that Dad had made a substantial donation to the alumni fund the same month Jessica submitted her application. When I was eventually accepted to University of Colorado Law School, my parents treated it like a consolation prize. "It's a good school," my father said with the enthusiasm of someone commenting on mediocre weather. "Public education has its place." Jessica, meanwhile, received a full celebration dinner at the country club, complete with champagne toasts and congratulatory calls to relatives. Law school became my sanctuary. Away from the constant comparisons and casual dismissals, I discovered who I was when I wasn't being measured against Jessica's manufactured accomplishments. My professors recognized my potential immediately. Professor Williams became my mentor, encouraging me to pursue family law despite my father's obvious disappointment in my career choice. "You have a gift for understanding people," she told me after I'd presented a particularly complex custody case study. "Don't let anyone convince you that helping families is less important than helping corporations." Her words were a lifeline during those moments when I questioned whether I'd chosen the right path. It was during my second year that I met Marcus Chen. He was quiet like me, studious and serious about his education. We were paired together for a constitutional law project, and I quickly discovered that he shared my passion for justice over profit. While other students talked about landing positions at prestigious firms and making partner before they were 30, Marcus and I discussed the cases that kept us up at night, the legal precedents that could change lives. "I want to make a difference," he told me one evening as we studied for our evidence exam in the law library. "My parents expect me to join my uncle's corporate firm, but I keep thinking about all the people who need advocates more than businesses need another lawyer to help them avoid taxes." We studied together regularly, sharing notes and challenging each other's arguments. Marcus had a brilliant legal mind, but more importantly, he had integrity. When other students tried to cheat on exams or plagiarize their papers, he refused to participate. When a professor showed obvious favoritism toward wealthy students, Marcus was the one who quietly reported it to the administration. After graduation, we went our separate ways. Marcus reluctantly joined his uncle's firm while I started at Morrison & Associates, the small family law practice where I'd interned during undergrad. We stayed in touch sporadically, exchanging holiday cards and occasional emails when one of us encountered an interesting case that reminded us of our law school discussions. I threw myself into my work with the same dedication I'd applied to my studies. Every case mattered to me, whether it was a simple, uncontested divorce or a complex custody battle involving abuse allegations. I worked weekends, studied new precedents during my lunch breaks, and took continuing education courses on my own dime. My client satisfaction ratings were consistently the highest in the firm, and my win rate in court was impressive for someone so young. But none of that mattered to my family. When I told them about winning a particularly difficult case that reunited 3 children with their grandmother after their parents died in a car accident, my father's response was to ask when I was going to start making real money. When I was promoted to senior associate after just 3 years, my mother's first comment was about how Jessica had already made partner at her corporate firm. The pattern continued when I met Daniel, the man who would eventually become Emma and Tyler's father. He was a paramedic, kind and funny, and completely unimpressed by my family's wealth or status. We met when he brought a child abuse victim to the hospital where I was gathering evidence for a custody case. His compassion for vulnerable people matched my own, and we fell in love quickly. My parents hated him from the moment I brought him home for dinner. Not because he was unkind or irresponsible, but because he didn't fit their vision of who I should marry. He drove an old pickup truck instead of a luxury sedan. He lived in a modest apartment instead of a mansion. He measured success by the lives he saved rather than the money he made. "You could do so much better," my mother said after that disastrous dinner where Jessica had spent the entire meal making subtle digs about Daniel's career. "You're a lawyer, Kara. You should be with someone who matches your ambition." But Daniel did match my ambition to make a difference, to help people, to build something meaningful rather than just profitable. When I got pregnant with Emma, my parents' disappointment was palpable. I wasn't married, I was only 28, and Daniel hadn't even proposed yet. Never mind that we were planning a future together, that we were both excited about becoming parents, that we'd found an apartment with better schools and a yard where our child could play. All they saw was another way I'd failed to meet their expectations. Jessica, meanwhile, had married David in an elaborate ceremony that cost more than most people's houses. She was working 70-hour weeks at her firm, traveling constantly, and had no interest in children yet. But she was married to the right kind of man, living in the right kind of house, pursuing the right kind of career. In their eyes, she was still the golden child while I was the disappointment. When Emma was born, my parents visited the hospital exactly once. They brought an expensive gift set and took a few photos, but they seemed uncomfortable holding her, as if associating too closely with my situation might reflect poorly on them. Jessica didn't visit at all, claiming she was too busy with a major case that couldn't wait. Daniel and I married when Emma was 6 months old, a small ceremony at the courthouse with his family and a few close friends. My parents attended, but made it clear they considered it a formality rather than a celebration. There was no reception, no honeymoon, no announcement in the society pages. Just 2 people who loved each other making a commitment to build a life together. For a few years, we were happy. Daniel and I worked as a team, balancing our demanding careers with parenthood. Emma was a bright, curious child who brought joy to every room she entered. When Tyler was born 2 years later, our little family felt complete. We didn't have much money, but we had each other, and that felt like enough. Then Daniel died. It was a routine call, a minor car accident on the highway. But the drunk driver who caused the collision had been going 80 miles per hour when he slammed into the ambulance. Daniel died instantly, along with his partner and the patient they were transporting. I was home with the kids when the knock came on the door. Two uniformed officers with expressions that told me everything before they spoke a word. The funeral was a blur of sympathy flowers and casseroles from neighbors. My parents attended, but seemed more concerned with how the tragedy reflected on the family than with supporting me through my grief. "You're young," my mother said, as we stood beside Daniel's grave. "You'll rebuild your life, find someone more suitable this time." Even in my darkest moment, they couldn't offer unconditional love and support. Instead, they saw opportunity in my tragedy, a chance for me to start over and make better choices according to their standards. The suggestion that Daniel was somehow unsuitable, that his death was an opportunity for improvement, nearly broke me. Jessica's response was even worse. She offered to help with childcare so I could focus on work and finding a new husband. As if my children were inconveniences to be managed rather than the most precious parts of my shattered world. As if replacing their father was more important than helping them heal from his loss. I threw myself into single parenthood with the same determination I'd always applied to everything else. Emma was 4 and Tyler was 2, old enough to know their daddy was gone, but too young to understand why. We went to grief counseling together, created new routines, found ways to honor Daniel's memory while building our new normal. My parents helped occasionally, but their assistance always came with judgment. When I needed a babysitter for a late court appearance, they'd watch the kids but spend the entire evening commenting on my parenting choices. When I accepted their financial help to cover Daniel's funeral expenses, they used it as leverage to criticize my spending habits for months. Afterward, the criticism intensified as the children grew older. Emma's independence, which I fostered as a way to build her confidence, was seen as neglect. Tyler's sensitivity, which I nurtured as emotional intelligence, was viewed as weakness. They constantly compared my children to Jessica's hypothetical future offspring, discussing all the advantages those imaginary children would have with their 2-parent household and unlimited resources. When Jessica finally started trying to have children, my parents' attention shifted almost entirely to her fertility journey. Every failed cycle was treated as a family tragedy. Every new treatment option discussed at length over family dinners. Meanwhile, my actual children sat at the same table, listening to their grandparents obsess over the babies their aunt couldn't have while barely acknowledging the ones she already did. The final straw came last Christmas. Emma had made honor roll again, and Tyler had been selected for the gifted program at his school. I was bursting with pride, excited to share their accomplishments with the family. But when we arrived at the Christmas gathering, the conversation immediately turned to Jessica's latest round of IVF treatments. "We're cautiously optimistic," David said, his arm around Jessica's shoulders. "The doctor thinks this protocol might be the one." My parents hung on every word, asking detailed questions about hormone levels and implantation rates. When I tried to share Emma's academic achievements, my mother waved me off. "That's nice, dear. Jessica, tell us more about the new clinic you're considering." Emma noticed. Of course she did. At 8 years old, she was already too smart for her own good, too perceptive to miss the way her accomplishments were dismissed, while her aunt's medical procedures were treated as front-page news. She didn't say anything that night, but later, as I tucked her into bed, she asked the question that broke my heart. "Mommy, why don't Grandma and Grandpa care about what happens to me and Tyler?" I held her close, struggling to find an answer that wouldn't poison her relationship with her grandparents while still validating her feelings. How do you explain to a child that some people's love comes with conditions? That some families operate on hierarchies rather than equality? That night, I realized that the pattern I'd accepted for myself was now affecting my children. Emma and Tyler were experiencing the same dismissal, the same casual neglect that had shaped my entire relationship. With my family, they were learning that their worth was measured against impossible standards, that their achievements mattered less than other people's struggles. I started documenting everything after that, not because I planned to use it against them, but because I needed to see the pattern clearly. The missed school events, where they claimed to be too busy while attending every one of Jessica's work functions. The expensive gifts for holidays that were inappropriate for children but photographed. Well, for social media. The conversations where they discussed Emma and Tyler's futures as if they were burdens to be managed rather than potential to be nurtured. Looking back now, sitting in my empty apartment after the adoption papers ambush, I could see how methodically they'd built their case. Every offer to help that came with strings attached, every criticism disguised as concern, every comparison that positioned Jessica as the superior choice for raising children. They'd been preparing for this moment for months, maybe years, gathering evidence of my inadequacy while positioning themselves as the worried relatives stepping in to save neglected children. The cruelest part was how they'd used my love for Emma and Tyler against me. They knew I'd sacrifice anything for their well-being, including my own happiness. They counted on my maternal instincts to make me doubt myself, to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe my children would be better off with Jessica's resources and stability. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd forgotten that the little girl who'd taught herself piano after they stopped paying for lessons had grown into a woman who specialized in fighting for families just like ours. They'd underestimated the quiet child who'd documented her achievements in a private journal, not realizing she'd grown into an attorney who understood the importance of evidence and preparation. Most importantly, they'd assumed that because I'd accepted their treatment of me, I'd accept their treatment of my children. They were about to learn the difference between a daughter seeking approval and a mother protecting her babies. The woman who'd spent years trying to earn their love was gone. In her place stood someone who'd learned that the most important battles are the ones you fight for people who can't fight for themselves. Tomorrow, I would start building my case. Tonight, I allowed myself one last moment of grief for the family. I'd always wished I had, the parents who should have celebrated my strength instead of exploiting it, the sister who should have been my ally instead of my competitor. Then I closed that chapter forever and focused on the only family that truly mattered, the two beautiful children who were somewhere across town, probably wondering why their mother hadn't come home. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. While my family slept comfortably in their suburban mansions, believing they'd cornered me into submission, I was already 3 steps ahead of their game. They thought they knew me, thought they understood my limitations, but they'd spent so many years dismissing me that they'd never bothered to learn who I'd actually become. I made coffee in the pre-dawn darkness and opened my laptop on the kitchen table where Emma usually did her homework. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to wage the most important legal battle of my career from the same spot where my 8-year-old daughter practiced multiplication tables. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about proving that love and determination could triumph over money and manipulation. My first call was to Sarah Mitchell, the private investigator I'd worked with on several custody cases. Sarah was a former police detective who specialized in family law investigations, and she had an uncanny ability to uncover information that others missed. More importantly, she understood that in custody battles, the truth wasn't always obvious, and the people who appeared most respectable on the surface often had the darkest secrets. "Kara," she answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. "I heard through the grapevine that you might need my services. Something about your own family turning against you?" Word traveled fast in Denver's legal community, especially when it involved one of their own. I gave her a brief overview of the situation, careful to stick to facts rather than emotions. "I need everything," I told her. "Financial records, employment history, personal relationships, social media activity. If there's anything that shows Jessica and David aren't the perfect parents they're pretending to be, I need to know about it." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her tapping a pen against her desk, a habit she had when she was thinking through a complex case. "You know this is going to get ugly," she said finally. "When families turn on each other like this, there's usually more going on than what appears on the surface. Are you prepared for what we might find?" I thought about Emma's confused face when I didn't pick her up from school as promised, about Tyler asking when he could come home, about my children sleeping in a house where they were viewed as trophies to be won rather than people to be loved. "I'm prepared for anything," I said. "My children's lives depend on this." Sarah agreed to start immediately, and I wired her retainer from my savings account. It was money I'd been setting aside for Emma's college fund, but I knew that if I lost this battle, there wouldn't be any college funds to worry about. My next call was to Professor Williams. Despite the early hour, she answered with the same sharp intelligence that had made her legendary among law students. "Kara, I've been expecting your call. I assume you're not just reaching out for a friendly chat about constitutional law?" I explained the situation, and I could hear her intake of breath when I got to the part about the forced adoption papers. "Those bastards," she said, her usually refined language giving way to pure emotion. "I'm sorry, but that's exactly what they are. Using children as weapons in a power play is the most despicable thing I can imagine." Professor Williams had never married or had children of her own, but she'd spent 40 years watching families destroy each other in courtrooms, and she had strong opinions about people who use children as pawns. "I need expert witnesses," I told her. "Child psychologists, social workers, anyone who can testify about the importance of maintaining existing parental bonds and the trauma of unnecessary separation." She was already making notes. I could hear her pen scratching across paper. "I have connections at Children's Hospital and the University of Denver. Dr. Rebecca Torres specializes in attachment theory and has testified in hundreds of custody cases. Dr. Michael Reynolds is a social worker who evaluates family dynamics for the court system. Both of them will tell you that ripping children away from a loving parent because of financial status is psychological abuse." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler. "Kara, you need to know that this case is going to be about more than just legal arguments. It's going to be about showing the court who you really are versus who your family is trying to make you appear to be. Are you ready for that level of scrutiny?" I looked around my modest apartment, at the photos of Emma and Tyler laughing, at the evidence of a life built on love rather than money. "I've been ready my whole life," I said. "I just didn't know it until now." Professor Williams agreed to help coordinate my expert witnesses and promised to review my legal strategy once I had it outlined. Before she hung up, she added something that would stay with me throughout the entire battle. "Remember, Kara, the law isn't just about rules and precedents. It's about justice. And sometimes justice requires us to fight battles that seem impossible to win." I spent the rest of the morning researching Judge Marcus Chen's recent decisions in custody cases. What I found gave me hope. In case after case, he'd ruled in favor of maintaining existing family structures unless there was clear evidence of abuse or neglect. He'd written scathing opinions about the tendency to equate financial resources with parenting ability, and he'd consistently prioritized children's emotional well-being over material advantages. In one particularly relevant case, he'd denied a wealthy grandparent's petition for custody of their grandchildren after their son's death, writing, "The court finds no evidence that material advantages can compensate for the severing of established emotional bonds. Children are not commodities to be transferred to the highest bidder." Reading those words, I felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, I had an ally on the bench who understood what this case was really about. But I couldn't rely on Marcus's integrity alone. I needed to build an airtight case that would make it impossible for anyone to question my fitness as a parent. I started with my employment records, gathering documentation of my professional achievements, client testimonials, and peer reviews. My supervisor at Morrison & Associates provided a glowing recommendation that highlighted my dedication to families in crisis and my reputation for going above and beyond for her clients. Next, I collected evidence of my children's well-being under my care. School records showing their academic performance, medical records documenting their excellent health, letters from teachers praising their behavior and emotional development. I interviewed their pediatrician, Dr. Amanda Foster, who had known Emma since birth and Tyler since he was 6 months old. "Those children are thriving," Dr. Foster told me during our meeting in her office. "They're confident, articulate, and clearly very loved. Emma takes care of Tyler with a maturity that speaks to excellent modeling at home. And Tyler shows none of the behavioral issues we typically see in children from unstable environments. If someone is suggesting that you're an unfit mother, they're either lying or they don't understand what good parenting looks like." I asked her to provide a written statement for the court file, and she agreed immediately. "I've seen real neglect and abuse," she said as she walked me to the door. "What you're dealing with isn't about your children's welfare. It's about power and control, and that's much more dangerous than anything you've ever exposed your children to." While I was building my defense, Sarah was uncovering information about Jessica and David that painted a very different picture than the one they presented to the world. Jessica's career success had come at a significant personal cost. Her colleagues described a woman who was brilliant but ruthless, who thought nothing of throwing subordinates under the bus to advance her own agenda. She'd been involved in 3 major ethical complaints over the years, all of which had been quietly settled to avoid public scrutiny. David's business dealings were even more interesting. His construction company had been cited numerous times for safety violations, and there were ongoing investigations into several projects where corner cutting had resulted in structural problems. More damaging was the pattern of lawsuits from former employees claiming wage theft and unsafe working conditions. These weren't the kind of people who should be trusted with vulnerable children, but the most shocking discovery came when Sarah investigated their fertility struggles. Jessica had been lying about the extent of their problems. Medical records obtained through careful investigation showed that the issue wasn't infertility at all, but Jessica's refusal to interrupt her career for pregnancy. She'd undergone multiple elective procedures to delay conception, including having her eggs frozen so she could postpone childbearing until it was more convenient. The IVF treatments my parents had discussed so sympathetically at family gatherings were actually Jessica's attempts to get pregnant quickly now that she'd decided she wanted children, but on her timeline rather than nature's. The failed cycles weren't medical tragedies. They were the predictable result of prioritizing career advancement over family planning well into her 30s. "This changes everything," Sarah told me when she presented her findings. "They're not the devoted couple struggling with infertility that they've portrayed to your family. They're opportunists who see your children as a shortcut to the family they never prioritized creating naturally." I stared at the medical records, feeling a mixture of vindication and disgust. My children weren't being targeted because Jessica and David would be better parents. They were being targeted because Jessica and David wanted to skip the inconvenient parts of parenthood and go straight to having school-age children who could be shown off at social events. While Sarah continued her investigation, I focused on building relationships with Emma and Tyler's support network. Mrs. Chen, our elderly neighbor who often helped with childcare, provided a statement about the children's daily routines and emotional development. Their teachers wrote letters describing happy, well-adjusted children who spoke lovingly about their mother and showed no signs of the neglect or instability that my family was alleging. The most powerful testimony came from Emma herself, though she didn't know she was providing it. During one of our supervised visits while the children stayed with my parents, I asked her to tell me about her favorite memories. What she described was a childhood rich with love, attention, and meaningful experiences. She talked about our Saturday morning pancake traditions, the bedtime stories we created together, the way we turned grocery shopping into educational games about math and nutrition. "Remember when Tyler was scared of the dark and you taught him that shadows were just friends who couldn't speak?" she said, curled up next to me on my parents' stiff formal sofa. "And remember when I was sad about Lucy moving away and you helped me write her letters every week until she felt like she wasn't really gone?" These weren't the memories of a neglected child. These were the treasures of a little girl who felt deeply loved and securely attached to her mother. Tyler, at 6, was less articulate but equally revealing. When I asked him what made him feel safe, he immediately said, "When you sing the thunder song during storms." I'd forgotten about that song, a silly little ditty I'd made up to help him overcome his fear of thunderstorms. But he remembered every word, and the fact that it still made him feel secure showed how deeply our bond had been established. I was also building a financial case that demonstrated my stability, despite my family's claims to the contrary. Yes, I lived modestly compared to Jessica and David, but my finances were solid. I had steady employment, health insurance, a growing savings account, and no significant debt beyond my student loans. My children had never gone without necessities, and I'd managed to provide them with enriching experiences within our budget. More importantly, I was documenting the ways that my family's wealth had actually been used to control and manipulate rather than to help. The times they'd offered financial assistance and then used it as leverage to criticize my parenting. The expensive gifts that were inappropriate for children but made good photo opportunities for their social media. The promises of help that came with strings attached designed to make me dependent on their approval. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered the real reason behind the timing of the custody filing. Jessica's law firm was up for a major promotion, and she was competing against 2 other partners for a position that would make her one of the youngest senior partners in the firm's history. The deciding factor, according to Sarah's sources, within the legal community was likely to be perceived stability and family values. She needs to present herself as a well-rounded person with strong family connections, Sarah explained. 2 attractive, articulate children would be the perfect accessories for someone trying to project that image. The timing isn't coincidental, Kara. This custody grab is part of her career strategy. Armed with this information, I began crafting a legal strategy that would expose the real motivations behind the adoption petition. I couldn't just defend my parenting. I needed to go on the offensive and show the court that this wasn't about the children's welfare at all. It was about Jessica's ambition and my parents' need to control the family narrative. I spent evenings at the law library, researching precedents and crafting arguments. I studied every case involving wealthy relatives trying to gain custody of children from less affluent parents, looking for patterns and successful defense strategies. I wrote and rewrote my opening statement until every word was perfect, every argument airtight. The most challenging part was maintaining my composure while my children remained in my parents' custody during the investigation period. Every day, without them, felt like a year, and I had to constantly resist the urge to violate the temporary agreement and demand to see them. I knew that any misstep on my part would be used as evidence of my instability, so I followed every rule precisely while building my case. I also had to prepare for the emotional warfare that was sure to come. My family wouldn't just attack my parenting, they'd attack my character, my choices, my entire life. They'd try to make me doubt myself, to break down my confidence and make me believe that maybe they were right. Maybe my children would be better off without me. But every time I felt my resolve wavering, I'd remember Emma's laugh when I made silly voices during story time, or Tyler's proud smile when he successfully tied his shoes after weeks of practice. I'd think about the way they ran to me when they were hurt, the trust in their eyes when they shared their secrets, the absolute certainty in their voices when they said, "I love you, Mommy." Those memories became my armor against the psychological attacks I knew were coming. No amount of money could buy the kind of bond I had with my children, and no legal maneuvering could erase the foundation of love and trust we'd built together over their entire lives. 3 weeks into my preparation, I received an unexpected ally. Alex Rodriguez, a paralegal at a rival firm, reached out with information about David's business practices. Alex had worked on some of the cases involving David's construction company, and he was disgusted by what he'd seen. "I can't officially testify because of confidentiality agreements," he told me during a clandestine meeting at a coffee shop downtown. But I can point you toward public records that will tell the story. David Chen has been cutting corners on safety for years, and it's only a matter of time before someone gets seriously hurt. Alex provided me with a roadmap to investigate. David's business dealings, including case numbers for lawsuits and regulatory filings that painted a picture of a man more concerned with profit than people's well-being. The information Alex provided led to even more disturbing discoveries. David's company had been involved in several projects where cost-cutting measures had resulted in safety hazards. A shopping center where faulty electrical work had caused a fire. An apartment complex where substandard materials had led to structural problems. A school renovation where asbestos wasn't properly contained, exposing children and teachers to dangerous fibers. This wasn't just about business ethics. It was about a pattern of putting people at risk for financial gain. The same mentality that allowed David to endanger construction workers and building occupants would apply to child rearing. He'd prioritize appearance over substance, shortcuts over safety, profit over protection. As the court date approached, I felt like a general, preparing for the most important battle of my life. I had expert witnesses lined up to testify about child development and attachment theory. I had documentation proving my children's health and happiness under my care. I had evidence of my family's real motivations and David's questionable character. Most importantly, I had the truth on my side. Not the version of truth my family had constructed to serve their purposes, but the real truth about what was best for Emma and Tyler. They belonged with the parent who had loved them from their first breath, who had sacrificed for them, who had built a life around their needs rather than treating them as additions to an existing lifestyle. The night before the hearing, I sat in Emma's room, surrounded by her artwork and favorite books. I could still smell her strawberry shampoo on the pillow, still see the indentation in Tyler's mattress where he curled up with his stuffed elephant every night. These weren't just bedrooms. They were sanctuaries where my children felt safe and loved. Tomorrow, I would walk into that courtroom not as the dismissed daughter or the overlooked sister, but as a mother fighting for her children's right to remain with the parent who had earned their love through countless acts of daily devotion. My family had underestimated me for the last time. They were about to discover that quiet people don't stay quiet when their children are threatened. I'd spent weeks building my case methodically, gathering evidence like a detective, preparing arguments like a scholar, and steeling myself emotionally like a warrior. Everything I'd learned in law school, every case I'd won, every skill I'd developed had been preparation for this moment. They thought they held all the advantages. Money, connections, social status, but they'd forgotten the most powerful advantage of all, the fierce love of a mother who would move mountains to protect her children. Tomorrow, Judge Marcus Chen would see exactly what that love looked like when it was backed by legal expertise and righteous fury. My children were coming home, no matter what it cost me. The morning of November 15th dawned gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cut through even the heaviest coat. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror at 5 a.m, applying makeup with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside me. Today would determine whether I kept my children or lost them forever to people who saw them as convenient accessories to their perfect lives. I'd chosen my outfit carefully the night before. A navy blue suit that conveyed professionalism without ostentation, pearl earrings that had been a gift from Daniel's mother, and low heels that would allow me to stand confidently for hours if necessary. I looked like exactly what I was. A competent attorney and devoted mother who belonged in that courtroom defending her family. The drive to the Denver Family Court building took only 15 minutes, but it felt like crossing a battlefield. I parked in the same spot where I'd stood countless times representing other parents in similar fights, never imagining I'd one day be on the other side of the legal system. The irony was sharp and bitter. All those cases I'd won for other families had been practiced for the most important case of my life. Professor Williams was waiting for me in the courthouse lobby, flanked by Dr. Rebecca Torres and Dr. Michael Reynolds, the expert witnesses who would testify about child development and attachment theory. Their presence was reassuring, a reminder that I wasn't facing this battle alone. Professor Williams squeezed my shoulder as we walked toward the elevator. Remember, Kara, the truth has a way of revealing itself. All you have to do is give it the space to emerge. Her words carried the weight of 4 decades in courtrooms, watching justice prevail even when the odds seemed impossible. Dr. Torres nodded in agreement, her kind eyes reflecting the compassion that had made her one of the most respected child psychologists in Colorado. "I've reviewed all the documentation you provided," she said quietly as we rode up to the 3rd floor. "What you've built with Emma and Tyler is exactly what every child development expert hopes to see: secure attachment, emotional stability, and age-appropriate independence. Any judge who understands child welfare will see that immediately." As we approached courtroom 3B, I saw my family's legal team assembled like an army preparing for siege. My father had hired Thompson, Kessler and Associates, one of Denver's most expensive family law firms. Lead attorney Patricia Thompson had a reputation for winning custody cases through intimidation and character assassination rather than facts and law. She was standing with Jessica and David, all 3 of them dressed in coordinated shades of charcoal gray that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in a year. My parents sat on the bench behind the plaintiff's table, my mother wearing her best mourning pearls as if attending a funeral rather than a custody hearing. My father's expression was grim but determined, the same look he'd worn when closing difficult business deals. They weren't here as concerned grandparents seeking what was best for their grandchildren. They were here as power brokers protecting their investment in Jessica's image. Jessica herself looked every inch the successful attorney and devoted wife. Her hair was styled in soft waves that conveyed warmth without appearing unprofessional, and her makeup was applied with the skill of someone who understood how to project competence and compassion simultaneously. She was playing a role, and she was playing it well. David sat beside her in an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the nervous energy radiating from his body. He kept checking his phone and adjusting his tie, clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny that would come with being in court. Unlike Jessica, who thrived under pressure, David preferred to operate behind the scenes where his questionable business practices wouldn't be examined too closely. I took my seat at the defendant's table, spreading my files with the precision of someone who knew every piece of evidence by heart. Sarah Mitchell had done her job thoroughly, and I had documentation that would expose every lie my family had constructed to support their case. More importantly, I had the truth about what kind of parent I was and what kind of people Jessica and David really were. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Marcus Chen entered from his chambers. Seeing him in his black robes, sitting behind the bench where he'd make the decision that would determine my children's future, I felt a complex mix of emotions. This was the same man who'd studied constitutional law beside me, who'd shared coffee and conversations about justice during late nights in the law library. But he was also a professional who would base his decision on evidence and law, not personal relationships. Marcus's eyes met mine briefly as he settled into his chair, and I saw a flicker of recognition followed immediately by judicial neutrality. He would be fair, but he wouldn't let our history influence his judgment. If anything, knowing me personally might make him more stringent in examining my case to avoid any appearance of favoritism. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority that came with his position. "We're here today for the matter of Castell versus Castell, a petition for emergency custody and adoption of minor children Emma Castell, age 8, and Tyler Castell, age 6. Ms. Thompson, you may proceed with your opening statement." Patricia Thompson rose from her chair with the confident stride of someone who'd never lost a case she expected to win. Her opening statement was a masterpiece of manipulation, painting Jessica and David as the ideal family while subtly undermining every aspect of my life and character. "Your Honor, we're here today because 2 beautiful children are living in circumstances that no caring family can ignore any longer. The petitioners, Jessica and David Castell, are not seeking to destroy a family, they're seeking to save one. For months, they've watched with growing concern as their niece and nephew have been subjected to instability, financial stress, and the constant uncertainty that comes with being raised by a single parent who, despite her best intentions, simply cannot provide the stability these children need and deserve. She gestured toward Jessica and David, who looked appropriately solemn and concerned. Mrs. Castell is a partner at one of Denver's most prestigious law firms, with a proven track record of success and stability. Mr. Castell is a successful businessman who has built his company from the ground up through hard work and integrity. Together, they can offer Emma and Tyler everything they need: a stable two-parent home, financial security, educational opportunities, and most importantly, the kind of structured environment that will allow them to thrive. Thompson then turned her attention to me, her voice taking on a tone of manufactured sympathy. The respondent, Ms. Kara Castell, is undoubtedly a loving mother. No one questions her affection for her children. However, love alone is not enough to provide for children's complex needs. Ms. Castell works long hours at a small law firm, often leaving her children to fend for themselves. 8-year-old Emma has been forced to take on adult responsibilities, preparing breakfast for herself and her younger brother because their mother is already at work. 6-year-old Tyler has been exhibiting signs of anxiety and attachment issues, likely stemming from the constant uncertainty in his home environment. Every word was carefully chosen to sound reasonable and compassionate while building a case for my unfitness as a parent. Thompson was skilled at her craft, I had to admit. She was presenting half-truths and twisted interpretations as established facts, creating a narrative that made Jessica and David appear heroic while making me seem neglectful. Furthermore, Your Honor, Ms. Castell's financial situation has deteriorated significantly since her husband's death 3 years ago. Despite working full-time, she struggles to make ends meet, often relying on family assistance for basic needs. The children have had to change schools twice due to housing instability, and they frequently go without extras like extracurricular activities and educational enrichment that other children their age enjoy. The lies were woven so smoothly, with partial truths that someone without access to the real facts might find them convincing. Yes, I worked long hours, but so did most single parents. Yes, Emma helped with breakfast sometimes, but because I was teaching her independence, not because I was neglecting her. Yes, we lived modestly, but my children had never gone without anything they truly needed. Thompson concluded her opening with a flourish designed to tug at the court's heartstrings. The petitioners are not asking the court to punish Ms. Castell for her circumstances. They're asking for the opportunity to provide Emma and Tyler with the stability, security, and opportunities that every child deserves. This is not about taking children away from their mother. This is about giving children the chance to reach their full potential in an environment where they can thrive. When she sat down, the courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of my mother dabbing her eyes with a tissue. The performance had been flawless, and I could see why Thompson commanded such high fees. But performances, no matter how skilled, could be dismantled by facts and evidence. Marcus looked in my direction and nodded. Ms. Castell, your opening statement. I stood slowly, taking a moment to look at each person in the courtroom before beginning. When I spoke, my voice was clear and strong, carrying the conviction that came from absolute certainty in my position. Your Honor, what we've just heard is a carefully constructed fiction designed to obscure a simple truth. This case is not about child welfare. It's about power, control, and convenience. The petitioners are not concerned grandparents and relatives stepping in to save neglected children. They are opportunists who see my children as a shortcut to the family they never prioritized creating, naturally. I saw Jessica's composure crack slightly, her eyes narrowing as she realized I wasn't going to play the role of the grateful, defeated single mother they'd expected. Thompson made a note on her legal pad, probably planning her objection strategy. Emma and Tyler Castell are not suffering children in need of rescue. They are happy, healthy, thriving kids who have been raised with love, attention, and age-appropriate expectations. They excel academically, have strong friendships, and display the emotional security that comes from knowing they are unconditionally loved by their parent. The picture Ms. Thompson has painted bears no resemblance to reality. I walked slightly closer to the bench, maintaining eye contact with Marcus as I spoke. Your Honor, over the next several days, this court will hear testimony from teachers, doctors, neighbors, and child development experts. Every single one of them will tell you the same thing. Emma and Tyler are exactly where they belong, with the parent who has loved and cared for them since birth. Then I shifted my tone, preparing to expose the real motivations behind the custody petition. What this court will also discover is that the petitioner's concern for my children's welfare is recent and convenient. Mrs. Jessica Castell has spent minimal time with Emma and Tyler throughout their lives, showing interest only when it served her purposes. Mr. David Castell has an even more limited relationship with the children. Neither of them has ever provided consistent childcare, emotional support, or meaningful involvement in the children's daily lives. I paused to let that sink in before delivering the most damaging information. Furthermore, Your Honor, the evidence will show that this custody petition coincides suspiciously with Mrs. Castell's pursuit of a senior partnership at her law firm, a position that would benefit significantly from the appearance of family stability and traditional values. The children my opponents claim to want to protect are actually being used as props in a career advancement strategy. Jessica's face had gone pale, and David was shifting uncomfortably in his seat. My parents looked confused, clearly not understanding the implications of what I was revealing. Thompson was scribbling furiously, probably trying to figure out how to counteract evidence she hadn't expected me to possess. Your Honor, the petitioners ask this court to sever the bonds between children and their loving mother based on the premise that financial resources matter more than emotional security. They want you to believe that a bigger house and a larger bank account can compensate for the trauma of removing children from the only home they've ever known. The evidence will prove not only that this is false, but that the petitioners themselves lack the character and stability they claim to offer. I concluded by returning to the fundamental question at the heart of the case. This court must decide whether Emma and Tyler Castell should remain with the parent who has devoted her life to their well-being, or whether they should be transferred to relatives who view them as convenient additions to their lifestyle. The choice, Your Honor, is between genuine love and calculated opportunism. I trust that justice will prevail. As I sat down, I could feel the energy in the courtroom shift. My opening statement had accomplished exactly what I'd intended. It had reframed the entire case. Instead of being on the defensive about my parenting, I was now on the offensive about their motivations. Instead of justifying my choices, I was exposing their lies. Marcus nodded toward Thompson. You may call your first witness. Thompson stood and called Jessica to the stand. Watching my sister take the oath to tell the truth, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. This was the woman who had shared a childhood with me, who had once been my closest companion. Now she was trying to steal my children based on lies and manipulations. Jessica's direct examination was polished and rehearsed. She spoke eloquently about her concerns for Emma and Tyler, describing incidents that had allegedly troubled her, about my parenting. She painted herself as the reluctant hero, stepping forward only when family duty demanded action. I've watched Kara struggle since Daniel's death, Jessica said, her voice heavy with manufactured concern. She tries so hard, but she's overwhelmed. The children are suffering because she won't admit she needs help. She went on to describe the stable, loving home she and David could provide, the educational opportunities they could offer, the security the children would have. But when it was my turn to cross-examine, I was ready. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, and I knew exactly how to dismantle her carefully constructed narrative. "Ms. Castell," I began, "you testified that you've been concerned about my children's welfare for months. Can you tell the court the last time you had Emma and Tyler overnight at your home before this custody petition was filed?" Jessica hesitated, clearly not expecting such a direct question. We've had them for visits. I'm asking specifically about overnight stays. When was the last time Emma and Tyler slept at your house?" The silence stretched uncomfortably before Jessica finally answered. "It's been some time. Our guest room wasn't set up for children." The admission hung in the air like an accusation. Here was a woman claiming to be desperately concerned about her niece and nephew's welfare, but she hadn't even prepared her home to accommodate them. In fact, Ms. Castell, according to my records, Emma and Tyler have never spent a single night at your home. Is that correct? Jessica's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of embarrassment spreading across her cheeks. "We preferred to visit them at their familiar environment." "So your concern for their well-being didn't extend to actually getting to know them in your own home?" I pressed. "You're asking this court to award you custody of children who have never even slept under your roof?" Thompson objected, claiming I was badgering the witness, but the damage was done. The jury could see that Jessica's supposed deep concern for my children was contradicted by her complete lack of involvement in their daily lives. I continued the cross-examination methodically, exposing lie after lie. Jessica claimed to know about Emma's academic struggles, but when I asked for specifics, she couldn't even tell me what grade Emma was in or who her teacher was. She spoke about Tyler's anxiety issues, but she couldn't describe a single incident she'd personally witnessed, or any comfort she'd provided. "Ms. Castell, you testified that you're concerned about the children's educational opportunities. Can you tell the court what Emma's favorite subject is?" Jessica looked trapped, clearly having no idea. She's very bright. She likes all her subjects." It was a generic answer that any stranger might give, not the response of someone who knew and loved my daughter. "Actually, Emma's favorite subject is marine biology. She wants to be an oceanographer when she grows up, and she reads college-level texts about sea life for fun. Did you know that?" Jessica's silence was answer enough. "Can you tell the court what Tyler's favorite book is?" Again, Jessica struggled to answer. "He likes children's books, age-appropriate stories. Tyler's favorite book is Where the Crawdads Sing, which I read to him chapter by chapter because he loves stories about nature and survival. He's read it 17 times. Were you aware of that?" Each question I asked revealed the vast gap between Jessica's claims of concern and her actual knowledge of my children. She was seeking custody of kids she barely knew, based on problems she couldn't specifically identify. The cross-examination continued for over an hour, and by the end, Jessica looked exhausted and defeated. Her polished exterior had cracked under the weight of her ignorance about the children she claimed to love. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that her testimony had been exposed as a carefully rehearsed performance rather than genuine concern. David's testimony was even more disastrous. Unlike Jessica, who was at least skilled at public speaking, David was clearly uncomfortable under questioning. His voice shook as he described his vision for raising Emma and Tyler, and he kept glancing at Thompson for guidance. When I cross-examined him, I focused on his business practices and character. "Mr. Castell, your construction company has been cited for safety violations 17 times in the past 3 years. Is that correct?" David shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting his business record to be relevant to a custody case. "There have been some regulatory issues, but that's common in construction," he began, but I cut him off with documentation. "These aren't minor regulatory issues, Mr. Castell. Your company was fined $50,000 last year for exposing workers to asbestos without proper safety equipment. Children were also exposed at a school renovation project. How does this demonstrate the safety-conscious approach you claim to bring to child rearing? Thompson objected repeatedly, claiming that David's business practices were irrelevant to his ability to parent. But Marcus overruled her objections, recognizing that character and judgment were absolutely relevant to custody decisions. I continued to present evidence of David's pattern of putting profit over people's safety, establishing that he couldn't be trusted to prioritize children's well-being over his own convenience. The most damaging moment came when I presented evidence of David's wage theft practices. Mr. Castell, you've been sued by 14 former employees for failure to pay agreed-upon wages. Some of these workers were immigrant families with children who depended on those paychecks to buy food and pay rent. Can you explain how someone who would steal from working families can be trusted to provide stability for children? David's answer was a series of stammered excuses about cash flow problems and misunderstandings. But the pattern was clear. He was willing to harm vulnerable people when it served his financial interests. Why would children be different? By the time David stepped down from the witness stand, the petitioner's case was in shambles. Jessica had been exposed as someone seeking custody of children she barely knew, and David had been revealed as a man whose character and judgment were questionable at best. But the most devastating testimony was yet to come. Thompson called my father to the stand, clearly hoping that his reputation and gravitas would salvage their case. Robert Castell was a formidable presence, and his testimony about my alleged failures as a parent was delivered with the conviction of someone accustomed to being believed without question. However, when I cross-examined my own father, I was prepared to expose the ugly truth about his motivations. Mr. Castell, you've testified about your concerns for Emma and Tyler's welfare. When did these concerns first arise? My father straightened his tie, a nervous habit I'd observed my entire life. We've been worried about Kara's situation since Daniel's death. Yet, according to your own financial records, which I've subpoenaed, you provided Jessica with $300,000 from a family fund that you told me didn't exist when I asked for help with Daniel's funeral expenses. How do you reconcile claiming concern for my children's welfare while refusing to help with their father's burial? The question landed like a physical blow. My father's face flushed red, and he struggled to respond. The courtroom was completely silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what I'd revealed. That was different. Jessica had a business plan. He started, but I interrupted with more documentation. Mr. Castell, this wasn't a business loan. According to the ITR paperwork, it was described as family development funding. Yet when your daughter needed help burying her husband and the father of your grandchildren, you claimed no such fund existed. Can you explain this discrepancy to the court? The cross-examination continued with me systematically exposing every lie, every manipulation, every instance where my family had chosen Jessica over me and my children. I presented evidence of the family fund that I'd been excluded from, the support that was freely given to Jessica but denied to me, the pattern of favoritism that had shaped our entire relationship. When I finished, my father looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his exposed hypocrisy. The man who had built his reputation on integrity and fair dealing had been revealed as someone who would lie under oath to support his preferred daughter's ambitions. Thompson tried to rehabilitate her witnesses during redirect examination, but the damage was too severe. Every answer they gave only reinforced the impression that this custody petition was driven by selfishness rather than genuine concern for children's welfare. As the first day of testimony concluded, I felt cautiously optimistic. The petitioner's case had been thoroughly demolished, their motivations exposed, their character questioned. But I knew that custody battles could take unexpected turns, and I couldn't afford to become overconfident. That evening, I sat in my empty apartment, reviewing my notes and preparing for the next day's testimony. Emma and Tyler were still staying with my parents, still confused about why they couldn't come home, still trusting that somehow this nightmare would end and their normal life would resume. Tomorrow, I would present my case, the evidence of my children's happiness and health, the testimony of experts who understood child development, the proof that removing Emma and Tyler from my care would cause irreparable harm. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction, knowing that the first phase of the battle had gone exactly as planned. My family had underestimated me for the last time. They'd walked into that courtroom expecting to face a defeated single mother grateful for their intervention. Instead, they'd encountered a skilled attorney armed with facts, evidence, and the fierce determination of a mother fighting for her children's lives. The truth was finally emerging, and it was far more powerful than any fiction they could construct. The second day of testimony began with me presenting my case, and the atmosphere in the courtroom felt completely different. Where the previous day had been about exposing lies and manipulation, today was about revealing truth and genuine love. I called Dr. Rebecca Torres to the stand first, and her testimony about child development and attachment theory was both compelling and damning to the petitioner's case. Removing children from a stable, loving environment and placing them with relatives they barely know would be psychologically traumatic, Dr. Torres explained to the court. Emma and Tyler Castell show every sign of secure attachment to their mother. They're confident, articulate, and emotionally stable. Disrupting that bond would cause lasting damage that no amount of material advantages could repair. She went on to describe the detailed psychological evaluations she'd conducted with both children during supervised visits. When I asked Emma about feeling safe, she immediately described specific moments with her mother: bedtime stories, help with homework, comfort during illness. When I asked Tyler the same question, he talked about his mother's presence during thunderstorms and her silly songs that made him feel brave. These are the responses of children who feel deeply secure in their primary attachment. Thompson's cross-examination focused on trying to get Dr. Torres to admit that financial stability mattered for children's welfare, but the psychologist held firm. Certainly children need basic necessities, she said. But psychological research is clear that emotional security trumps material advantages. A child who feels loved and protected in a modest home will thrive far better than a child who feels uncertain and displaced in a mansion. Dr. Michael Reynolds followed with testimony about family dynamics and the importance of maintaining existing structures unless there was clear evidence of harm. His evaluation of my family situation had been thorough, including interviews with Emma and Tyler's teachers, pediatrician, and neighbors. I found no evidence whatsoever of neglect or instability in Ms. Castell's home, he testified. The children are thriving academically, socially, and emotionally. They speak about their mother with obvious affection and respect. The suggestion that they would benefit from being removed from her care is not supported by any credible evidence. When Thompson tried to suggest that my work schedule was harmful to the children, Dr. Reynolds was ready with research data. Single working mothers are incredibly common in today's society, and children adapt well when they feel secure in their parents' love. Emma and Tyler show no signs of the behavioral problems we typically see in genuinely neglected children. Instead, they demonstrate resilience, empathy, and age-appropriate independence. Emma and Tyler's teachers testified via video conference, each one painting a picture of happy, well-adjusted children who spoke lovingly about their mother and showed no signs of distress or instability. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's third-grade teacher, was particularly compelling. Emma is one of the most emotionally mature children I've ever taught, she said. She talks about her mother with such pride and affection. When other children in the class have problems, Emma often comforts them by sharing strategies her mother taught her. This isn't a child who feels neglected or uncertain about her home life. Tyler's kindergarten teacher, Mr. Garcia, described a confident little boy who was slightly advanced for his age and showed excellent social skills. Tyler talks about his mother every day, he testified. He tells us about their weekend adventures, the books they read together, the games they play. He's clearly a child who feels very loved and secure. Dr. Amanda Foster, the children's pediatrician, provided medical testimony about their excellent health and development. "I've been caring for these children since birth," she said. "They've never missed a vaccination, never had an untreated illness, never shown signs of neglect or abuse. When they come for checkups, they're clean, well-fed, and clearly comfortable with their mother." Emma often translates medical terms for Tyler, showing the kind of maturity that comes from a parent who explains things and involves children appropriately in their own health care. But the most powerful testimony came from Mrs. Chen, our elderly neighbor who had become like a grandmother to Emma and Tyler. Her English was accented but clear, and her love for my children was evident in every word. "These children, they are so happy," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Every day after school, they run to their mama like she is the most important person in the world. They help each other, they play together, they never fight like some children do." When Tyler was sick with fever last winter, Emma sat with him all night, reading stories and bringing cool cloths like her mama taught her. This is not neglect. This is beautiful family. Mrs. Chen went on to describe the countless times she'd observed our daily routines through her kitchen window. "I see Mama helping with homework every night at kitchen table. I see them dancing together while making dinner. I see Mama reading stories before bedtime. On weekends, they go to library, to park, always together, always laughing. Why someone want to break this beautiful thing?" When Thompson tried to suggest that Mrs. Chen's observations weren't professional evaluations, the elderly woman fixed her with a steely gaze. "I raise 5 children. I help raise 12 grandchildren. Know what good mother looks like. Kara is best mother I ever see." The testimony continued with character witnesses who had known our family for years. Daniel's former partner from the paramedic service described the devoted father Daniel had been, and the supportive wife I'd been to him. "After Daniel died, Kara never once complained about having to do it alone," he said. "She just focused on making sure those kids knew they were loved and safe. She's exactly the kind of parent any child would be lucky to have." Sarah Mitchell took the stand to present her investigation findings, methodically laying out the evidence of Jessica and David's real motivations and questionable character. She detailed Jessica's fertility deceptions, David's business violations, and the timing that connected the custody petition to Jessica's career advancement. "This isn't about child welfare," Sarah testified. "The evidence clearly shows this custody petition was filed to support Mrs. Jessica Castell's pursuit of a senior partnership position. The children are being used as props in a career strategy, not protected as vulnerable individuals who need help." Professor Williams provided expert testimony about legal ethics and the misuse of family court systems. Her reputation was impeccable, and her words carried tremendous weight with Marcus. "Using children as pawns in adult power struggles is a form of abuse," she testified. "When wealthy relatives attempt to gain custody of children from loving, but less affluent parents, they're essentially arguing that money matters more than love. This court must reject that premise or risk legitimizing the commodification of children." By the time I finished presenting my case, the contrast with the petitioner's testimony was stark. Where they had offered empty claims and manufactured concern, I had provided concrete evidence of my children's well-being and happiness. Where they had demonstrated ignorance about Emma and Tyler's personalities and needs, I had shown intimate knowledge of every aspect of their lives. Thompson made a valiant effort during her closing argument, returning to themes of financial stability and 2-parent households. But her words rang hollow after the devastating testimony that had exposed her client's true motivations and lack of genuine relationship with my children. When it was my turn for closing arguments, I stood, before Marcus and spoke from my heart as much as my legal training. Your Honor, this case has never been about what's best for Emma and Tyler. If it were, we wouldn't be here, because any honest evaluation would conclude that they belong exactly where they are, with the parent who has loved and cared for them since birth. I gestured toward the evidence we'd presented. You've heard testimony from teachers, doctors, neighbors, and experts, all confirming the same truth. These are happy, healthy, thriving children who feel secure and loved in their current home. You've also heard evidence that the petitioners barely know these children, have never been involved in their daily care, and are motivated by career advancement rather than genuine concern. Moving closer to the bench, I continued. The petitioners ask this court to believe that wealth can substitute for love, that a bigger house can replace genuine attachment, that disrupting a stable family is justified by the promise of private schools and trust funds. But, Your Honor, children are not investments to be moved around for better returns. They are human beings who deserve to remain with the parent who has earned their love through daily acts of devotion. I paused, thinking about Emma and Tyler waiting at my parents' house, confused and frightened about their uncertain future. Emma and Tyler Castell don't need to be rescued from poverty or neglect, because they're experiencing neither. They need to be protected from adults who would use them as accessories to enhance their own image. They need this court to recognize that the most important thing any parent can give a child is unconditional love, and that's something no amount of money can buy. My voice grew stronger as I concluded. Your Honor, I'm not asking this court to choose between rich relatives and a poor mother. I'm asking you to choose between people who want these children for what they represent and the parent who loves them for who they are. I'm asking you to choose love over manipulation, truth over deception, justice over convenience. As I sat down, the courtroom was completely silent. Even Thompson seemed to understand that her case had been thoroughly demolished by the weight of evidence and the power of truth. Marcus retired to his chambers to deliberate, and the waiting began. I sat in the courthouse hallway with Professor Williams and my expert witnesses, trying not to think about what would happen if somehow justice failed and Emma and Tyler were awarded to Jessica and David. 47 minutes later, the bailiff called us back into the courtroom. Marcus had returned to the bench, and his expression was unreadable as we took our seats. The next few minutes would determine whether my children came home with me or became casualties in my family's twisted power game. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, Marcus began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, this court finds that the petition for emergency custody and adoption is without merit and is hereby denied. The relief that flooded through me was so intense I nearly collapsed, but Marcus wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court finds that the petition was filed in bad faith, motivated not by genuine concern for the minor children's welfare, but by the petitioner's desire to enhance their own social and professional standing. The evidence clearly establishes that Emma and Tyler Castell are thriving in their current environment, and that removing them from their mother's care would cause significant psychological harm. Marcus's voice grew stern as he addressed Jessica and David directly. The court is deeply troubled by the petitioner's apparent belief that financial resources justify the disruption of a stable family unit. Children are not commodities to be transferred to the highest bidder, and this court will not participate in such commodification. He turned his attention to my parents, and his disapproval was evident. The court is equally troubled by the grandparents' role in this matter. Their documented pattern of favoritism and financial manipulation suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes children's best interests. Finally, Marcus looked directly at me, and for a moment, I saw not the judge, but the classmate, who had shared my passion for justice. Ms. Castell, custody of Emma and Tyler Castell is hereby returned to you immediately. The court finds you to be a loving, competent parent who has provided excellent care for your children despite challenging circumstances. The gavel came down with finality, And suddenly people were moving around me, congratulating me, gathering papers, preparing to leave. But I sat still for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. My children were coming. The nightmare was over. Professor Williams squeezed my shoulder. "Justice prevailed," she said simply. Dr. Torres smiled warmly. "Those children are lucky to have you fighting for them." Sarah Mitchell was already on her phone, probably updating her case files with another victory for truth over manipulation. Across the courtroom, Jessica sat in stunned silence while David fumbled with his briefcase. My parents looked older somehow, diminished by the public exposure of their favoritism and lies. Thompson was speaking in urgent whispers with her clients, probably discussing damage control and whether an appeal was possible. But I didn't care about their shock or disappointment. All that mattered was getting to Emma and Tyler and bringing them home where they belonged. I gathered my files quickly and headed for the exit, eager to end this separation that had already lasted far too long. The drive to my parents' house felt surreal after the intensity of the courtroom. I parked in their circular driveway and walked to the front door with my court order in hand, just in case they tried to create additional obstacles. But when the door opened, it was Emma who answered, her face lighting up with joy when she saw me. "Mommy!" she screamed, launching herself into my arms with such force that I staggered backward. Tyler appeared behind her, moving more cautiously, but with equal excitement. "Are we going home now?" he asked, his 6-year-old voice hopeful but uncertain. "Yes, baby," I said, kneeling down to hug them both. "We're going home right now, and we're never going to be separated like this again." Emma pulled back to look at me seriously. "I knew you'd come for us," she said with the confidence of a child who had never doubted her mother's love. "I told Tyler that mommies always fight for their babies." My parents appeared in the hallway behind the children, their faces reflecting shame and defeat. My mother was crying quietly, though whether from grief over losing or guilt over their actions, I couldn't tell. My father looked like a man who had bet everything on a sure thing and lost spectacularly. "Kara," my mother began, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Not today," I said firmly. "Today is about getting my children home safely. We can talk about the rest later, if at all." I helped Emma and Tyler gather their belongings, which had multiplied during their stay as my parents, tried to buy their affection with expensive toys and clothes. As we loaded the car, Emma asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mommy, why did Grandma and Grandpa want us to live with Aunt Jessica instead of you?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes adults make mistakes, sweetheart. Sometimes they think they know what's best even when they're wrong. But the important thing is that the judge understood we belong together." Tyler nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Chen said families should stay together unless someone is being hurt. She said you would never hurt us." The wisdom of that elderly woman had clearly made an impression on my son, and I made a mental note to thank her again for her support during this difficult time. The drive home was filled with chatter about what had happened during our separation. Emma told me about the fancy dinners at my parents' house that weren't as good as our regular meals together. Tyler described the expensive toys that weren't as fun as our weekend library trips and park adventures. Both children seemed relieved to be returning to our normal life, confirming what all the experts had testified. Children value stability and love over luxury and status. That evening, as I tucked them into their own beds in their own rooms, surrounded by their familiar belongings and favorite things, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in weeks. Emma asked me to read from her marine biology book, the same one Jessica hadn't known existed. Tyler requested his thunder song, the silly little tune I'd made up to help him overcome his fears. As I sang softly in the darkness of Tyler's room, I realized that this experience had changed me fundamentally. I was no longer the daughter seeking approval from parents who would never give it, or the sister competing with someone who had never viewed me as an equal. I was simply a mother who had fought for her children and won. The next few months brought unexpected changes. Jessica's law firm, apparently concerned about the negative publicity from the custody case, passed her over for the senior partnership she'd been seeking. David's construction company faced increased scrutiny from regulatory agencies, and several pending contracts were canceled due to concerns about his business practices. My parents made several attempts to reconcile, sending gifts and letters that I left unopened. Professor Williams advised me to document everything in case they tried to file new legal challenges, but I suspected their appetite for courtroom battles had been permanently diminished. Marcus and I crossed paths several months later at a legal conference, and he pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I hope you know that our history didn't influence my decision," he said seriously. "The law and the evidence were clear." I thanked him for his fairness and professionalism, and we shared a moment of mutual respect for the justice system we'd both devoted our careers to serving. Emma and Tyler thrived in the months following the custody battle. Emma's confidence grew as she realized that adults couldn't simply take children away from loving parents without good reason. Tyler's anxiety about storms and separations decreased significantly once he understood that our family was permanent and protected by law. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter from Jessica. It was brief and formal, acknowledging that she had been wrong to pursue custody and apologizing for the pain she had caused. I never responded, but I kept the letter as evidence that even people who seem irredeemably selfish can sometimes recognize their mistakes. The most meaningful change was in my own relationship with my children. The experience had shown all of us how precious and powerful our bond was, how worth fighting for our little family could be. Emma began telling people proudly that her mother was a lawyer who helped families stay together. Tyler started introducing me to new people as my mommy who won in court. 1 year after the custody battle, we moved to a new apartment with better schools and a backyard where Emma could plant the garden she'd been dreaming about. We could afford the upgrade because my reputation from the case had brought new clients to the firm, people who specifically requested the attorney who had fought so hard for her own family. As I tucked Emma and Tyler into bed that first night, in our new home, Emma asked me a question that showed how much she'd grown from our experience. "Mommy, if someone tries to take us away again, will you fight for us?" I kissed her forehead and smiled. "Baby, I'll always fight for you. But more importantly, you now know that you're worth fighting for, no matter what anyone else says." Tyler sleepily added his own wisdom. "And we'll fight for you too, Mommy. Families protect each other." As I turned off their bedroom lights and headed to my own room, I realized that my children had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, when it's genuine and fierce and backed by determination, can overcome any obstacle. The little girl who had been erased from family, photos, and excluded from opportunities had grown into a woman who refused to let her own children experience that same dismissal. The quiet daughter who had accepted crumbs of affection had become a mother who demanded nothing less than the full protection of the law for her family. Emma and Tyler were safe, loved, and home where they belonged. And I was no longer the person who waited for others to value her worth. I was the person who knew her own value and refused to accept anything less than what she deserved. Justice had prevailed, but more importantly, love had won. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.